Obviously, a while back, I did a review of a China-only motherboard made by AMD called the 4800S desktop kit. There it is in the background. I'm sure Oliver can pull up some library footage of the board. And I've paired it with a non-XT version of the RX 6700. There's no GPU equivalent in the PC space to what Series X's GPU is. However, this one is very, very close to the PlayStation 5's 36 compute units, RDNA 2, same amount of texture mapping units, an awful lot of spec points that are very close to PlayStation 5, right? So, yes, basically what I've got here is a PC that's running the Xbox Series X CPU. It's literally the same thing. And a GPU that's very close to the PlayStation 5. Call it a Frankenstein's console, if you like. Yeah, so basically I've installed Starfield on it, and so you're going to be seeing like captions on our frame rate graph saying console settings, but it's got an asterisk on it, and it's basically the closest we could get to console settings. We're running it at 4K resolution, FSR2 quality mode, or rather 67% resolution scaling. DRS, dynamic resolution scaling, it isn't active in any of this testing. It might be active on consoles, right? And I suspect possibly it is, but whatever. Yeah, so first of all, let's take a look at this. Now, weirdly, even though it supports dynamic resolution scaling, Starfield doesn't have a frame rate cap. So I don't quite know how they're calculating it. But what I've done here is to use Special K's frame rate limiter, which has specific options to lock to half refresh rate, 30 FPS, just like the consoles. And yeah, it's even got decent input lag using this latent sync option. So I'm using Aquila here as a pretty heavy spot for testing. You can see that frame time's consistent at 33 milliseconds until we hit areas where we're GPU limited. I'm pretty sure we are GPU limited, by the way, as you'll see later on. But yeah, you can see that we have actually managed to cap Starfield's frame rate, and it looks and feels, when it's running at 30, just like the Xbox Series X version. So sort of job done there. So yeah, that was quite an interesting exercise. But first of all, we're going to be removing the frame rate cap, turning VSync off. So this is, as close as we can get to Starfield on console running with an unlocked frame rate. So yeah, let's return to Aquila. VSync off. We bottom out at 30 frames per second throughout the entire sequence. But yeah, we're sort of in a 30 to 40 FPS no man's land. And I don't know what you think, John, but this kind of validates the idea of a 30 FPS cap, right? Which is if you want consistent performance, basically you have to balance the GPU and the CPU and always have a bit of overhead left over to ensure consistency.
That's exactly right. And as we can see here, that is not achievable with your settings here. But this also presumes then that you're using the same settings as the 30 FPS mode on Xbox, right? So I guess the question is, could we actually reduce these settings further to get there?
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, or use dynamic resolution, which
More
we haven't
aggressively.
got active here.
Like,
Yeah,
for instance, imagine if you had Series S style settings on a Series X. Could you get to 60? Maybe,
well,
maybe not.
We'll test that a bit later on.
We will, exactly.
Yeah, let's continue with just the basic unlocked performance, and had a look at Neon next, which is a very interesting environment. This touches 40 FPS, but that nightclub area with all the lighting there does seem to be quite heavy. Again, it's another validation here that 30 FPS cap is based on this CPU and GPU profile is basically the right move. My house at Nesoi, very foliage heavy, forests, that kind of thing.
Wait, Rich,
super hard.
You did that? You did the thing where you have like the at the beginning of the game where you shackle yourself with a mortgage?
Yes, and I deeply regret it, but it did throw up this instantly interesting GPU bound scenario where we were looking for foliage and forests, and it's super hard on the GPU. If VSync on, it's actually dipping below 30 FPS, but with VSync off, we're kind of around that sort of area and above. So again, this all says to me that 30 FPS is the right move. And again, when you have that first fight scene at the beginning of the game, 30 to 40 FPS. I mean, it all sort of points towards the concept that the game has basically been balanced for 30 FPS on this class of hardware. Now, the question is, can we go any higher? Because we've got that statement from Todd Howard saying, well, parts of the game run to 60 frames per second, right? And basically space combat, this is right at the beginning of the game again, 35 to 50 frames per second. I'd say this was, well, going into this test, I thought that would be our best chance of hitting 60. Don't quite manage it. But the first research station mission basically is pretty much in 50 to 60 frames per second territory, which I think is possibly validation of what Todd was referring to. I mean, this game is so big, there's almost certainly going to be areas that will run at 60, right? Depending on density. So, we've got a PC here that's got basically CPU and GPU performance that's going to be in the ballpark of what the consoles are doing, and it all validates the 30 frames per second side of things. And the other thing I think I noticed here is that we've seen no evidence that at 30 frames per second or even going higher that we're CPU limited anywhere. So, basically, like what you said earlier, John, maybe if there was to be a performance mode, they could drop the resolution and then basically achieve a different kind of hardware balance, which I found quite an interesting notion. It's something we can do, right? So the way I did that was to basically think to myself, well, how would a potential performance mode work for Xbox Series X? We've got Series S running at 1440p, 900p internal resolution, right, with FSR2 upscaling. And it looks all right, doesn't it? That's something you mentioned in your content, Oliver. The Series X versus Series S comparison, 1440p versus 4K. It looked pretty decent, right?
Yeah, it looks quite good. And it's a smaller difference than what we usually see between the two machines. And really, in typical play, the only difference that you're really noticing is that the Series S is a little bit softer, but the various settings downgrades outside of that don't really make much of an impact, and the game actually looks quite good on Series S.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in theory, then, what if we sort of tweaked the resolution downwards to 1440p to match Series S to unlock more performance, but I haven't reduced any of the other quality settings, which Series S has got a few things that have been tweaked there. So we go back to Aquila first of all, VSync off again. It's now in the high 40s to begin with. And I'd still think we're actually GPU limited here. But as we move into the town, we get some pretty aggressive frame time issues, which I do think is a CPU limit. But most of the time, we're still beyond 40 frames per second. And so, possibly a 40 frames per second mode with a different GPU balance or a different tweak to dynamic resolution scaling bounds could be viable, or possibly something, a VRR specific mode. And the further I tested this, the more interesting results I got. So we had some interesting results with Neon just running it unlocked, but running it with the reduced resolution unlocked, Neon basically runs locked to 60 frames per second, which I couldn't quite believe. Yeah. And then I went into the nightclub, some minor dips there, but, the whole thing was basically running at 60. And there's no real need as such to confine ourselves to 1440p. You could, in theory, just have dynamic resolution scaling, pushing the resolution as high as possible until it hits the CPU limit. Space combat, perhaps unsurprisingly, 60 frames per second when I rerun that test. Now, obviously, it's early on in the game. Maybe some of the later battles are a bit more intense, but, clearly we've got CPU and GPU headroom to get a much higher frame rate than 30 if you tweak that resolution. The research lab obviously was quite interesting in our first tests because we were in the 50s there, just at 4K resolution. En route to the research lab in our sort of makeshift performance mode, mid 40s upwards, but once we actually get inside the research area, so again, what I tested was basically locked to 60 frames per second, which I found really, really interesting. Now, going back to my horrific misjudgment in getting that house necessary, I think we're still GPU limited here, even with the reduced resolution, but, we're still north of 40 frames per second. So, yeah, I'd say this is pretty interesting testing, right? Because I think there is grounds here for possibly having a 40 FPS mode. Now, obviously, the scope of the test is limited, right?
Yeah.
And we've no idea really how representative our makeshift Frankenstein's console is of actual Series X rather performance, but it's an interesting indicator.